Hello, everybody. We're going to do an activity today, generating some data around the topic of probability. And we need to understand probability in the context of genetics. So much of the work that this guy, Gregor Mendel, did, right, as the father of genetics, was in fact probability work, right? He was collecting data and trying to make sense of that data. So Gregor Mendel studied pea plants, as we know. Some estimates suggest he looked at 30,000 pea plants and probably hundreds of thousands of peas from those plants. And so he had a lot of data from which he was able to look at probability. Remember, why did he study peas? They're small, pretty easy to grow. You can grow a couple seasons per, or a couple rounds per season. They're easy to mate. They reproduce a lot, so you get some pretty quick results. A couple things to keep in mind, right? Because we're going to try and apply the ideas of probability to genetics. Some things to keep in mind. Remember, there's different types of cells, right? Somatic cells are your body cells. Gametic cells, right, are the ones like the sex cells, right? So in the case of the pea plants, the pollen and the eggs of the peas. So remind yourself what Gregor Mendel did quickly. Because pea plants are fairly unique, because they have both sexes in the same flower, they can actually be pollinated to them. The pollen can be applied to themselves and they can fertilize their own eggs, right? And or you can cross-pollinate them. You can take the pollen from one plant and touch it to the anther of, to the staple of another plant, and you can get cross-pollination. So when we start talking about probabilities, you're going to see it mostly in the context of talking about genotypes versus phenotypes. What's the probability that I have this genotype? What are the probabilities that my offspring are going to have this phenotype? So remind yourself what that means again. So in this particular case, it says, what's the dominant trait? We should know that the dominant trait is green. Well, how do we know that? Well, because the green pea has a capital G in it, and we know we only use capital letters for dominant traits. Furthermore, the only way we can have a yellow pea is we have two recessive alleles here, and that's the only way. In the absence of a dominant allele can we have a recessive trait show up. Okay. The parent is heterozygote, and remember that just means hetero means different, and you're describing what made the zygote, right? The two alleles that came together here. So in this case, a capital G and the lowercase g are different than each other, thus hetero. What is the genotype of the female? Well, homozygous. Now the letters are the same, and this parent, the female, only can provide to its offspring, the only option it can give is a lowercase g. And then the offspring is this. What's the probability of that? What's the chance of that happening? How can we figure that out? That's our goal. So we're going to do a quick lab. You can either use your own real pennies, or you can use, on page 11 you'll see is where the notes are for this of your interactive notebook, and or there's a little link on there that'll allow you to flip pennies online too if you need that, if you can't find any pennies around the place. So probability, just a very short little bit of notes here to put together, is the likelihood that a particular event will occur. So there's possibilities, right? You could have, it's possible to have a yellow pea, it's possible to have a green pea, but what's the likelihood or the probability of having a green or a yellow, right? We can do that mathematically. And again, that's what Gregor Mendel did. That's what was so important about his work, is that he quantified it, right? Everybody knew that genes or that traits came from parents. I mean, people knew that for generations before Gregor Mendel, but he was the first one to put the math to it and show people sort of why. Okay. So past outcomes in probability cases do not affect future ones, at least in real probability. If I'm flipping a coin, right, if I flip 8 heads in a row, the next time I flip that coin, I'm no more likely to flip a head than I am a tail, right? It's a 50-50 chance every time, so that's important to remember with probability. It's a little bit different in genetics, but pretty much the same idea. And then in order to figure out probability mathematically, a fairly simple equation, the number of events divided by the number of possible events. So the number of events of choice divided by the number of possible events. And you'll see what that means once we start doing Punnett squares. But for now, that's just sort of the mathematical explanation. Okay, that's all. Have fun with the activity, generate some data, and